Shavuot Tov Rabotai. We're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Terumot. We're up to Perek Gimel Mishnah Daled. Today's Mishnah should be Le'Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev and Eliyahu ben Barcha Israel of Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. In yesterday's Mishnah, we learned that Rabbi Akiva ruled that the Terumah separation made by one of two partners is not effective for the share of the other partner. Today's Mishnah is going to limit the ruling of Rabbi Akiva. In what case are the words of Rabbi Akiva stated? Meaning, when did Rabbi Akiva say that the Trumah separation made by one partner does not work for the share of the other partner? Bishelo diber. That applies only where the first partner did not speak to his partner and get his permission to separate Terumah for his share. Aval yoshad ben beto o et avdo o et shifchato litrom terumato terumah. But if one gave permission to his partner, or even to a member of his household, or even to his servant or his maidservant, whether they are Jewish or Canaanite, to separate terumah, terumato terumah, his terumah, the portion that was separated by the appointed person, is valid terumah. And the Mefarshim point out, Rabbi Akiva holds that one partner is presumably unwilling to have the other separate terumah for his share. But if he gives permission, however, the terumah separated by the partner is valid. Now, giving permission works not only for his partner who owns some of the produce, but even for a household member who doesn't own any of it. Additionally, even Canaanite slaves, both men and women, can separate terumah for a Jewish owner. Even though we learned in the first Mishnah in this Masechet that non-Jews are generally unable to separate terumah from a Jew's produce, Canaanite slaves are different because they have the status of Jews to some degree, meaning they're obligated in certain commandments. In fact, it's really possible for the owner to have any Jewish adult separate terumah on his behalf. Why did the Mishnah specify one's family member and his servants? Because in that case, there's an extra chidush. It's not necessary to directly instruct them to separate terumah. He only has to suggest it indirectly. For example, by saying, if you want, separate terumah. That's why the Mishnah singled out household members and servants or maidservants. The Mishnah now teaches what happens when an owner gave permission to someone to separate terumah on his behalf, and then after the person left, he decided to withdraw the permission. The Mishnah says, bitel, if he canceled the permission that he gave, the halacha is like this. Imat shelo taram bitel en terumato terumah. If he canceled the permission before the other person separated the terumah, en terumato terumah, his terumah is not valid. V'im shetaram bitel terumato terumah. But if he canceled the permission after the other person had already separated terumah, his terumah is valid. And the Mishnah concludes by discussing now the matter of a worker separating terumah for the produce of his employer. The Mishnah says, "Hapoalim enlem reshut litrom." Workers do not have permission to separate terumah for their employer's produce. And what's the chidush? We do not presume that since he hired them to work with this produce, that he gives them permission to separate terumah from it. Except the Mishnah says, "Chutz mina derochot," except for workers who tread. What does that mean? The Mefarshim explain, we are referring to workers who are chaverim, workers who are careful to avoid becoming tameh, who are hired by an am haaretz, who's somebody that transmits tumah to what he touches, to tread on the grapes in the winepress. In that case, it's clear that he wants them to separate his terumah for him, so that the terumah does not become tameh. Why? Shen mitameim etagat miyad. We want that the chaverim, the workers, should separate the terumah when they start trading the grapes, because the owner will touch and transmit tumah to the winepress immediately afterwards, and then it will become too late to separate terumah that's ta'or. And the Mefarshim explain. The Mefarshim go at length to explain. An am haaretz is an uneducated person who is ignorant of the laws of ta'ara and does not try to keep himself ta'or. The rabbis decreed that anything touched by an am haaretz is tameh. However, since this am haaretz owner went out of his way to hire chaverim, who are generally tahor, to press his grapes, rather than press them himself or hire other am haaretzot to press them, he shows that he wants these workers to separate terumah for him so that the produce will not become tameh. Now, although he's an am haaretz, he knows that if the grapes or wine become tameh, the terumah separated from them would also become tameh, which is not ideal. In this case, therefore, the workers can indeed separate terumah without the owner's stated permission, because it's clear that he wants them to do so. The workers should set aside a portion of the juice soon after they start treading on the grapes, specifically after they walked in one direction across the winepress and then walked in the perpendicular direction, so that they have crisscrossed the winepress. However, they may not actually designate it as terumah at this point, because most of the grapes have not yet been processed, and it's forbidden to designate terumah from processed produce like juice for unprocessed produce like grapes. Rather, they set the portion aside, and later, after all the grapes had been pressed, they designate it as terumah. The reason for setting it aside so early on is that the Am Haaretz owner assumes that the workers actually designated terumah at this time, and then he feels free to touch the juice in the wine press, which would make all of it tameh. To prevent the juice from becoming tameh before terumah can be taken, the workers remove some tahor juice from the wine press before the owner touches it, and they later designate that portion as terumah. When do they in fact designate the separated juice as when they do actually separate the designated juice as terumah, the rest of the juice may very well be already tameh because the owner could have touched it. Although one should separate terumah that's tahor from produce that is tameh, although a person should not separate terumah that is tahor for produce that's tameh. We learned that in chapter 2, Mishnah 1. Here it's allowed because there's no other choice. The reason the Mishnah specifically also picked a wine press as opposed to an olive press is because the owner will likely touch the juice in a wine press in order to taste it. Therefore, the workers have to set aside some tahor juice before he does so. There is little danger, however, by the owner of a oil press, for the owner touching the oil in an olive press, since oil usually is not tasted. And that is then Rabotai Mishnah Daled. Mishnah Hey now discusses the matter of defining a part of one's produce from which one will separate terumah later. Ha'omer terumah tekri zeh betocho. If one says the terumah of this pile is inside it, u'maserotah betocho, or he says its ma'aserot are inside it, terumat ma'aser zeh betocho, or he says the terumat ma'aser of this pile is inside it, the halacha is subject to the following machloket. Rabbi Shimon says, kara shem. He has made a binding declaration, meaning since he said that the terumah or ma'aser will come from a specific part of the pile, he said inside as opposed to outer layer, his statement is binding and he may later separate terumah only from inside the pile and not from the outer layer or anywhere else. And the Mefarshim explain, the Torah says in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 18, Pasuk 4, the Torah describes terumah, Reshit deganecha tiroshecha. The first of your grain, wine, and oil. The term first implies that an initial portion which is distinct from the remainder, meaning to be valid, a terumah designation must clearly distinguish between the portion that is terumah and the remaining produce. Obviously, if a person physically removes a portion from a pile of produce and designates the entire portion as terumah, both the terumah portion and the remainder are clearly defined. On top of that, even if one simply says that a particular portion of the produce is terumah without removing it from the pile, he has defined the portion that he wants and so it becomes terumah. Although that pasuk speaks about terumah, the Mefarshim explained that halacha applies to masot as well. A statement of this type is cited in our Mishnah. What does it say? A statement of the type cited in our Mishnah, the terumah of this pile is inside it. It's not specific enough to actually designate terumah. Nevertheless, since it mentions only the inner part of the pile, which excludes the outer layer, it clearly eliminates the possibility of separating terumah from the outside layer. That's enough for the statement to be binding, in that terumah can be later separated only from the inner part of the pile and not from the outer layer or any other source. But the sages say, Ad she'omar bitzfono bidromo. His declaration is not binding until he says something more specific, like the terumah of this pile is on its northern side or on its southern side. Then he is limited to designating terumah from the side of the pile that he named. The Chachamim agree that the statement, the terumah of this pile is inside it, refers only to the inner part of the pile and excludes the outer layer. But since he didn't specify a particular section of the pile, it's as though he said nothing. He can later designate terumah from anywhere in the pile or even from a different source altogether. However, if he said that terumah of this pile is on its northern side, which is more specific, his statement is legally effective and terumah can later be separated only from the northern side of the pile. Rabbi Elazar Chisma says, Ha'omer terumat tekri mimenu alav kara shem. If one says the terumah of the pile is to be taken from it for the rest of it, he has made a binding declaration. According to this Tana, Rabbi Elazar Chisma, it's not necessary to specify any particular part of the pile. And then Mepharshim explain, when one says that terumah of the pile is to be taken from it for the rest of it, he includes the entire pile and does not exclude any of it. However, Rabbi Elazar Chisma holds that the statement is effective, meaning terumah cannot be separated from a different pile. Unlike Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim, who hold that such a statement has a legal force, even though it does not draw any distinction between one part of the pile and another. Right? Even though, unlike the Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim, who hold that such a statement has a legal force, even though it does not draw any distinction between one part of the pile and the other, Rabbi Elazar Chisma says he made a binding declaration. He doesn't have to specify any particular part of the pile. Now, Rabbi Shimon said, if one declares that Terumat Maaser of this pile is inside it, his statement is binding, even though the pile is ordinary tevel and not Maaser Rishon. Furthermore, according to Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim, although not Rabbi Elazar Chisma, some part of the pile must be specified. The next Tana disagrees with both of these rulings. Right, Rabotai, just to clarify again, Rabbi Elazar Chisma's opinion, Rabbi Elazar Chisma basically holds that although you didn't exclude any of the pile, he says that it's an effective statement that you cannot separate terumah from a different pile. Now, unlike Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim, I have to explain this more clearly, unlike Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim, Rabbi Elazar Chisma says that such a statement has legal force, even though it doesn't make a distinction between one part of the pile and another, as opposed to Rabbi Shimon and Chachamim who hold you have to make a distinction between one pile and another. One part of the pile and another, yes. So let's continue in the Mishnah. Like we said, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, "Haomer isur maaser ze asui terumat maaser alav kara shem." If one says a tenth of this maaser rishon is hereby made terumat maaser for it, kara shem, he has made a binding declaration. Meaning, according to this Tana, terumat maaser can be designated only from maaser rishon and not from ordinary tevel. He also holds that there is no need to specify a part of the pile. Rather, a simple reference to a tenth, which could be anywhere in the pile, is enough. Now, the Mefarshim point out there are two disputes between Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov and Rabbi Shimon. Number one, Rabbi Shimon implied that even part of ordinary tevel can be designated as the portion from which Tumat Maaser will be later separated, whereas Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov holds first, a person has to separate Maaser Rishon, and only then Terumat Maaser can be designated from the Maaser Rishon. According to Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim, a second difference, it is necessary to define the part of the pile from which the Terumah or Maaser will be separated, while Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov holds no specification is needed. He holds it's enough to say that any tenth of the Maaser Rishon will become Terumat Maaser. In this respect, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov agrees with Rabbi Elazar Chisma, who ruled that specification is not required. And the Rav concludes, "V'leit hilchata kechad minayu ele kechachamim bilvad." The halacha follows the opinion of the sages. That is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai leolam. Amen v'amen.